Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to Spirit Alive as we begin our fourth year of programming. I hope you all had a nice summer and had a little bit of time to rest and relax. Uh, Welcome back to our European and Asian participants. I know you will not be able to join us live tonight, but I hope you know that you're welcome and that you will have the opportunity to enjoy tonight's presentation at a time convenient for you. It takes a little while uh, for the recording to go up. You have to give us about 48 to 72 hours, and then you'll be able to access it by going to the Spirit Alive website and using the recordings button. And a very special welcome tonight to all of those who are joining us for the very first time. My name is Sister Maria Pascuzzi. I am the director of Spirit Alive, an educational institute made possible by the generosity of the Sisters of St. Joseph of Brentwood here in New York and the generous donations of so many of you. Thank you. Thank you so much. This season's webinar series, Climate, the New Catholic Imperative, is meant to call attention to our obligation to care for the natural environment. Though many connect the emergence of this concern with Pope Francis, a little research shows that care for the natural world has always been part of Catholic tradition and has always been understood as the common responsibility of Catholics, no less than non-Catholics. But as Pope Benedict XVI lamented in an address he gave in 2008 up in the Dolomites in northern Italy, he said, quote, "In recent decades, the doctrine of creation had almost disappeared in theology with its emphasis on redemption. We are now aware," Benedict said, "of the damage that this has caused." He went on to say, creation is groaning. We can sense it. We can almost hear it. And it is waiting for human beings who will preserve it. While more and more of us have come to understand and accept this responsibility, according to a Pew Research poll published just last September 2023, despite the outspokenness of John Paul II, of Benedict XVI, and especially Pope Francis, on our moral obligation to care for the natural world, U.S. Catholics are as divided as other Americans along party lines about whether or not there is a climate crisis, who or what is responsible for it, or even if there is a climate crisis. Why this debate persists and what we can do to move beyond it toward solutions is the subject of tonight's webinar presented by Dr. Anthony Strawa. It's an honor to have Dr. Strawa with us this evening. He is a graduate of the U.S. Air Force Academy and completed his Ph.D. at Stanford University. Dr. Strawa is an accomplished climate scientist who has authored over 50 peer-reviewed articles. Tony, as his friends call him, has 24 years experience with NASA in atmospheric science and is a senior scientist with the Secure the Future 2100 organization. He is the chief scientist for Sustainable Silicon Valley. He's a Catholic climate ambassador. In the past, did a little bit more to go out and spread the word about climate. And he has headed the Diocese of San Jose's Green Initiative, which focused on environmental equity. Tony volunteers on the San Jose Clean Energy Advisory Commission as well. About his own career path, Tony said the following, quote, "I was working at NASA as an aerospace engineer in the early 1900s. I was intrigued by the fact that computer models could not accurately predict climate without including the effects of particles in the air. I thought that my expertise in experimental diagnostics could be put to better use to help explain the effects of particles on climate instead of making airplanes go faster. It's difficult to believe," he said, "that 30 years later, we are still not moving quickly to address the climate crisis. To address it, You have to believe it exists. And we are grateful to Dr. Strawa, who share with us the science and the facts we need to pledge ourselves to pick up the pace and do what we can to address the climate crisis. At the end of his presentation tonight, Tony will entertain your questions, but please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box anytime at all during the presentation. And you all the participants are muted, but you'll have to use the Q&A box if you'd like to be heard at the end. So I thank all of you, and Tony, it's a pleasure to have you, please. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that introduction, Sister Marie. I really appreciate it. And it's a pleasure to be here this evening with all of you to discuss a topic that I have been interested in for decades. I am Anthony Strawa. I am a retired NASA atmospheric scientist, and I currently volunteer for several climate-related nonprofits. The opinions I express are my own, and although I am a scientist, this is not a science story. This talk is a story about what we can do to address climate obstruction and move towards the climate crisis. We'll briefly visit the science, and then we'll talk about why some people choose to ignore that science. Next, we'll discuss the forces pushing to obstruct climate action and suggest some ways to have productive conversations about climate action. I provided a list of reading material with references to the books, articles, and websites that I've used to prepare for this talk. You should have them in your email after the talk. The planet is undergoing a massive, uncontrolled experiment. People are emitting 2 million pounds of carbon dioxide, or CO2, per second into the atmosphere. This upsets the balance between climate systems and leads to global warming. All living things are participating in this experiment, whether directly contributing to it or feeling its impacts. There is a scientific consensus that this experiment is caused by human actions. Climate change is real and adversely affecting humanity and the planet. Many people often talk about belief in climate change. This suggests that it's not a debate over facts, but a question of faith, which, as we will see, is probably closer to the truth. I often use the term human-caused climate change and anthropogenic global warming interchangeably. So the chart you see now is a temperature timeline that was prepared by NASA. And it's the temperature rise since pre-industrial times. The important thing to note is the recent rapid rise in temperature after 1900. This past year was the hottest year on record. The global average temperature was about 1.5 degrees Celsius warmer than pre-industrial average, a milestone that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC, said was to be avoided in a report as recently as 2019. We know that heating of the planet is caused by the vast amounts of heat-trapping carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases that humans have added to the atmosphere, mostly by burning fossil fuels. Levels of carbon dioxide measured at NOAA's Mauna Loa Observatory surged to a seasonal peak of just under 427 parts per million in May. For comparison, pre-industrial CO2 concentrations were about 250 parts per million. So in 200 years, humans have nearly doubled the concentration of CO2 that has existed for centuries. This CO2 level led to the stable climate that allowed our civilization to flourish. This next chart, prepared by EPA, demonstrates that the warming we are experiencing is really due to human factors. The black line is the observations of temperature. The blue line is the warming due to natural influences such as solar irregularities and volcanic eruptions. The red line is the warming associated with human factors, such as burning fossil fuels and clearing the Amazonian rainforest. The pink line is for all influences put together. You can see that the pink line that includes both natural and human influences best matches the observations. But future warming is dependent on how people will respond to this climate crisis. Accordingly, the IPCC has adopted a number of scenarios called shared socioeconomic pathways that are based upon assumptions of how people will react to climate warming. This chart shows the temperature change that is associated with each of these scenarios. Let's examine a few. Starting at the bottom with scenario 1 in light blue, this scenario is the most ambitious and hardest to achieve. It requires a rapid decrease in the burning of fossil fuels, widespread development of clean energy, lower resource demands, and removing greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. We see that the temperature peaks at about 1.5 degrees centigrade before dropping slightly. But even so, this scenario would result in increasing the frequency and intensity of heat waves and extreme rainfall. Sea levels would inundate major coastal cities on a regular basis and put tens of millions of people around the world at risk from coastal flooding. Scenario 3 in yellow is described as middle of the road. This scenario lines up with what countries have pledged to do in the 2015 Paris Agreement. If every country actually fulfilled its existing obligations, it would mean about 2.7 degrees of warming by the year 2100. Under this scenario, the Arctic Ocean would be ice-free in the summer, which would cause ripple effects on weather all over the world. In fact, we are already seeing changes in the weather in the Northern Hemisphere due to the loss of summer ice in the Arctic. 2.7 degrees of warming would also cause a significant drop in global food production, far more extreme heat, more devastating flooding, as well as more severe droughts and a longer wildfire season. In this scenario, global development will not radically change. Inequalities will still persist between countries, and development will be slow, but there will be international cooperation on environmental goals. Scenario 4 in red will result when nationalism is resurgent and countries retreat from international cooperation. Countries would accelerate exploitation of their own fossil fuel resources. Investments in education and technology development would decline. Solving climate change would become a low international priority, and by the end of the century, sea levels will have risen about 2 feet, and the world will have warmed by roughly 3.6 degrees centigrade. That's about 2.2 degrees warmer than today. Right now, the world is on a path somewhere between scenario 3 and scenario 4. It's important to note that the I in IPCC stands for intergovernmental. This means that governments have a say in what information is presented, and they tend to be more conservative than scientists. These scenarios also do not take into account the possibility that a tipping point will be reached. Examples of tipping points are the extensive melting of glaciers in Greenland and Antarctica, which would lead to large sea level rise and massive floodings. Another example is a die-off of coral reefs that would impact ocean ecosystems. Both would result in profound and irreversible climate change. There's a link to a New York Times article in the reading material that discusses these tipping points in more detail if you're interested. To recap, the science is settled on the causes and effects of anthropogenic global warming, but not on what can be done about it. Of course, the most important and effective goal is to reduce and eliminate greenhouse gas emissions, but there are many paths to achieve this goal. So we see that there is a lot that needs to be done and very little time to accomplish the tasks. So why are we not acting more urgently? That brings us to the question of climate denial. Climate denial makes no sense to climate scientists, but it makes a lot of sense to social scientists. They know that the rejection of verifiable scientific information is often rooted in our culture and psychology. In his book, How Culture Shapes the Climate Debate, University of Michigan professor Andrew Hoffman outlines 4 central aspects of our psychology that can result in our rejecting the findings about climate change. We all use cognitive filters. That is, we interpret and validate information by filtering it through our worldviews. These cognitive filters reflect our cognitive identity. We develop a cognitive identity consistent with others within the groups with which we identify. These cognitive filters are useful because they furnish guidelines for practical action. On the other hand, without critical thinking, they can blind us to reality. Studies have shown that cultural identity can overcome scientific reasoning. So presenting more scientific data will probably not change anyone's mind. Lastly, our politics and economy create inertia for change. There is a vast physical infrastructure around the use of fossil fuels that cannot easily be replaced. Also, there are strong economic and political interests that are threatened by the responses to climate change. They adopt strategies to confuse and polarize the debate to protect their interests. So we see that the debate about climate change is not about greenhouse gases, but about opposing cultural values and worldviews. In 2008, the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication identified 6 groups of American adults which had different engagement in the climate crisis. This study was called the 6 Americas Study. The groups that you can see on the chart are alarmed, concerned, cautious, disengaged, doubtful, and dismissive. The percentages in the circle correspond to the percentage of population in each group. Yale updated their results in 2024 and found that despite the overwhelming scientific consensus on global warming, the dangers it is currently causing, and the potential for far more extreme damages, Americans' attitude toward global warming has not changed much over the last 10 years. It's encouraging that 3/4 of Americans favor using federal funds to support climate justice. On the other hand, about half think we should expand drilling for fossil fuels offshore and on government land. While 52% of the people surveyed said it was important for the president and Congress to take action on climate change, only 39% had heard of the Inflation Reduction Act, or IRA, that was passed by Congress in 2022. The IRA focused on reducing inflation, reducing drug and healthcare costs, and investing in renewable energy. It represents the largest investment towards addressing climate change in U.S. history. Only 39% of registered voters considered climate change a very important factor in the upcoming presidential election. Among Democrats, the percentage was 62. Amongst independents, it was 35. And amongst Republicans, only 11% said that global warming would be a very important issue in determining their vote for president. But this political polarization on environmental issues has not always existed. The chart you see is a brief history of climate action. Most people agree that the environmental movement started in 1962 when Rachel Carlson published her book, Silent Spring, about the effects of using pesticides. This book prompted President Kennedy to convene the Scientific Advisory Commission on Pesticides. In 1969, the Santa Barbara oil spill prompted President Nixon to put a moratorium on offshore oil drilling. In the 70s, the Nixon and Ford administrations passed a group of environmental legislation: clean air, clean water, Endangered Species, Safe Drinking Water, and Toxic Substances Control Acts. 1987 saw the adoption of the Montreal Protocol, which was adopted to eliminate the emission of hydrofluorocarbons that were destroying the stratospheric ozone layer. In 1997, the Kyoto Protocol was established, but under President George W. Bush, the U.S. refused to ratify it, citing potential harm to the U.S. economy in 2001. The Paris Agreement to limit greenhouse gas emissions was signed in 2015. President Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Agreement in 2019, and President Biden put the U.S. back in the Paris Agreement in 2020. The Obama administration passed the Clean Power Plan in 2015, and the Biden administration passed the Inflation Reduction Act and the Global Methane Pledge in the 2020s. You can see from this timeline that much environmental legislation before the 1980s was actually implemented and supported by Republican administrations. This is no longer the case. So what happened? We need to recognize that there is an overarching group who largely accept the science of global warming, but choose to obstruct action on solving the climate crisis. In today's world, we need urgent action to mitigate the damages that global warming can cause. We cannot only be concerned with deniers, but also with those who disagree about what should be done and obstruct climate action. Starting in the 1970s, the fossil fuel industry teamed with wealthy conservative donors to take advantage of the sociological factors that were outlined by Professor Hoffman to undermine the scientific consensus about global warming. Their aim is to stop or delay action to avert the climate crisis for economic and ideological reasons. The Koch brothers teamed with Gulf Oil and Chevron to found the Cato Institute that attempted to equate environmentalists with socialists. Later, the Heritage Institute, of recent Project 2025 fame, and the American Enterprise Institute were formed to spread disinformation about climate science. Their efforts are discussed in detail in the book Merchants of Doubt by Oreskes and Conway, and in the book Climate Obstruction by Eckberg et al. Here are some more common obstructionist talking points. Obstructionists claim that sometimes global warming is a hoax. It's driven by natural forces, or CO2 is not really harmful, or there is no urgency to the action needed to address this issue. However, in 2019, a study published by the Lancet Planetary Health Journal estimated that over 356,000 deaths annually could be attributed to heat-related causes due to climate change. And the World Health Organization estimated that global warming exacerbated air pollution is responsible for around 7 million deaths annually. So climate change is taking lives now, and we need action now. AstroTurf organizations began to spring up. These are false science organizations that are established to cast doubt on the real science. If you're interested in learning more about the myths that obstructionists put forward to undermine the science, I recommend the website, The Skeptical Scientist. There's a link to this website in the reading material. The site provides the myths that obstructionists claim, as well as information to refute these myths. Obstructionists say that climate actions will be harmful. Ideologically, they equate environmentalism with socialism and taking away our freedoms. In fact, environmental regulations protect our health and natural resources and preserve our way of life. Obstructionists claim that response to climate change will result in unacceptable changes in our way of life. In fact, they'll result in a healthier lifestyle and more efficient products. Obstructionists cast doubt on the effectiveness of proposed responses. We already know that the most important and effective response is to reduce and eliminate greenhouse gas emissions. Obstructionists claim that clean air and clean water regulations are responsible for high prices and take away our freedoms. Clean air regulations make for a healthier environment, and clean water regulations remove toxins from our drinking water. On the economic front, obstructionists say that sustainable energy is expensive and will cost jobs. On the contrary, we know from California's experience that it is possible to achieve significant economic growth while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Between 2000 and 2019, California has created millions of jobs, especially in the clean energy sector. California's economy grew by 63%, while per capita greenhouse gas emissions decreased by 23%. The state has one of the highest shares of renewable energy in the US. Another common obstructionist talking point is that cultural and infrastructure factors impede climate action. There's little reliable mass transit in the US and a proliferation of highways that results in many gas-burning cars on the road. Fossil fuels currently make up 80% of the energy used in the United States. So getting off fossil fuels will take time. Common sense would dictate then that this means we need more urgent action instead of delay. We can see examples of these talking points in a 2023 interview with the vice chair of the Conservative Climate Caucus, Congresswoman Mariannette Miller Meeks, an Iowa Republican. The interview was conducted by the New Yorker Radio Hour's David Remnick. Mr. Remnick asked the Congresswoman why she did not support the Biden administration's Inflation Reduction Act. Congresswoman Miller Meeks said that there was a difference amongst individuals about the urgency for action. She said she seeks common sense solutions that allow our economy to grow by producing more oil and natural gas. She also said that every time we advance that there is a crisis and there's doom and it doesn't materialize, scientists and political leaders lose credibility. As we have seen, these claims are not true or exaggerated. California's story shows that we can have economic growth while reducing emissions. Recent heat waves, severe storms demonstrate that climate action is needed urgently because the climate crisis is upon us now. I believe that it would have been more effective if Mr. Remnick started the interview with examples of warming in the Congresswoman's home state of Iowa. These include record heat and flooding and an increase in frost-free days, all of which affect agriculture and all of which are attributed to global warming and expected to get worse in coming years. This might have led the Congresswoman to talk about how these factors would affect agriculture in Iowa and her constituents instead of focusing on canned talking points. Incidentally, you can get information about how global warming is affecting various regions in the US from the National Climate Assessment, and there's a link in the reading material to that website. Another obstacle to productive public discourse is the echo chamber algorithms that are built into search engines and social media. The influence of social media on politics has grown over the years. In 1990, the nonpartisan Rock the Vote movement aimed to educate young people about their rights and get them more involved in politics. In 2008, the Obama campaign skillfully used social media to connect with young people. Today, social media personalities and pop culture icons have considerable influence in the political sphere. These days, many people, especially young people, use social media as their primary source of news and information. In a 2024 study in the journal Nature, Gonarides and Newell used data from Twitter and artificial intelligence and network analysis tools to map and profile climate change denial across the United States. The chart you're looking at shows the percentage of deniers by county. Higher numbers are darker red. The authors estimated that 15% of Americans do not believe in climate change, in approximate agreement with the Yale 6 America study. As the chart shows, this denialism is concentrated in the central and southern US. Political affiliation has the strongest correlation with climate denial, followed by level of education, COVID-19 vaccination rates, and income. Their analysis also revealed how a social media network used periodic events, such as cold weather and climate conferences, to sow disbelief about climate change and climate science. The consequences of this misinformation is that communities are unprepared to cope with the damages caused by global warming, such as the extreme heat we've experienced this summer and the cold snap in 2023 that left hundreds of thousands of people without power in Texas. As with other forms of misinformation, social media companies should flag accounts that spread falsehoods about climate change and collaborate on targeted educational campaigns. There is no question that people also need to be more discerning when interacting with social media by asking questions such as, who made this message? Why was it made? Who paid for it? What was omitted from the message? Was it fact, opinion, or even true at all? So why is it so difficult to agree on climate action? Besides dealing with obstructionists, global warming is a wicked problem. No joke, that's a real term. A wicked problem involves complex and interconnected social and technical systems. Certainly, this is what Pope Francis is saying in his encyclical Laudato Si when he coined the term integral ecology. This means that the climate crisis is concerned with the scientific, technological, social, economic, and political spheres, and that human and non-human worlds are interconnected. This kind of wicked problem requires integrated solutions. When the leader of one of the world's largest religious denominations, whose main goal is to save souls, takes time to write a major encyclical and follow that up with communication 7 years later, Laudate Deum, you know he considers climate inaction to be unethical and immoral. Care for creation should transcend religious affiliation, scientific understanding, economic systems, and politics. So integrated solutions to the climate crisis need to be innovative and interconnected, involving many human spheres and social change. I thought it would be instructive to take a look at some proposed solutions and see some of the competing opinions that are involved. These solutions are all forms of mitigation, which is the stopping of emissions from greenhouse gases, primarily by stopping fossil fuel burning. One suggestion is to incentivize the transition to electric vehicles. This is what the Inflation Reduction Act is doing. These incentives appear to be working, but they also need to be, we also need to build the infrastructure that supports these EVs, such as charging stations and storage. Adoption of EVs is much easier in urban environments. In rural environments, they don't have the infrastructure really to support EVs so much. But on the other hand, most automobiles are in an urban environment. Another suggestion is to green energy-intensive industries such as cement and steel production. One idea is to convert these industries to run on hydrogen. There are many types of hydrogen depending on how it is produced. Right now, the most common method is to use natural gas, but this does not really lower carbon emissions. A better solution is to use sustainable means, such as solar, wind, and geothermal, to generate hydrogen. These are developing technologies and still in their infancy. A third option is called carbon sequestration, or taking carbon out of the atmosphere, or preventing it from getting into the atmosphere and storing it. One method is through sustainable farming. Congresswoman Miller Meeks is a big proponent of this method since Iowa is a big farming state. No-till farming is practiced at about 30 to 40% of Iowa's cropland. Use of cover crops and organic farming also take about 5% of Iowa cropland. So sustainable farming is being used in Iowa, but there is much room for growth. One can also apply minerals to the soil or ocean to increase the absorption of CO2 and store it in solid form. CO2 capture from the atmosphere is currently technically possible, but expensive and energy intensive. CO2, of course, can also be captured at the source, at refineries, but this is a false solution because it only solves a small part of the problem. The process currently captures only 10 to 30% of the carbon in the fuel, and almost 100% of the remaining carbon content of the fuel is still emitted as CO2 when the fuel is used in vehicles. This method, of course, is favored by the oil and natural gas companies because it gives them an excuse to continue drilling for fossil fuels. In practice, many of these methods will have to be used in concert, and they are all expensive. So how can we pay for these solutions? Well, in the United States, we subsidize the oil and gas industry by approximately $650 billion per year to help them extract fossil fuels from the ground. A common sense approach would be to leave that fuel in the ground and use that money to transition to more sustainable energy sources. So what's the solution? How can we have constructive conversations about climate action? Roger Pelkey says that extreme positions dominate the discussion, and the potential for meaningful progress deteriorates. One side talks about the scientific problem, the other side talks about threats to freedom, scientific motives, and distrust of the process. Professor Hoffman advocates a consensus-based approach. He says that since the climate debate is about deeply entrenched ideological and cultural positions, a consensus-based solution is the most practical, where people with differing views agree on climate action. So I've compiled a list of strategies on getting to a consensus on climate solutions from several sources. First and foremost, listen. Before asking people to consider changing their worldviews, we must gain their trust. Be genuine, respect their opinion, and don't be combative. Look for common values. Sorry. Every belief system calls for care of creation. We are the caretakers of the earth for future generations. Climate action promotes social and economic equality. And climate action also affects certain groups. Global warming disproportionately affects certain groups, such as the young, the old, the poor, and the disenfranchised. It's okay to admit that the science is not perfect, but even the best case scenarios for global warming are scary and will have negative effects on humanity and future generations. Recall the IPCC scenarios that we discussed earlier. Be positive. Focus on the world we want, an emission and pollution-free, equitable, and healthy world. Talk about how global warming is affecting us now, particularly at the local level, as we saw in the interview with Congresswoman Miller Meeks. Extreme heat, increasing forest fires, more violent storms, flooding of coastal cities and rivers. Point out that climate action will improve the quality of life and a better future for the next generation and eliminate climate injustice. Focus on the co-benefits of climate action. Reduced car use and less reliance on fossil fuels in general means less air pollution and associated reduction in respiratory illnesses. There are also more jobs in sustainable energy than in fossil fuel industries. Set a good example. Get involved. I've listed several organizations in the reading materials that you might be interested in checking into. Two of them I'll mention here. Climate Action Now. Its goal is to make it easy for ordinary citizens to amplify their voices. And the Catholic Climate Covenant. They have a wonderful website and wonderful programs going on, and much of the information on their website is actually related to the theological rationale for climate action. Much can be accomplished at the local level by motivated people. So get involved in climate groups at your city and state level. These can often be the model for national action. There are also things you can do on a personal level. There are tons of books on ways to save energy and save money. Electrify as much as you are able. Transition from gas to electric appliances, especially cooktops. Electric, or better yet, induction cooktops eliminate climate emissions and reduce indoor air pollution. Switch from gas to heat pump water heaters and HVAC systems. Each of these accounts for about 30% of the energy used in a home. So converting can really make a big difference in eliminating greenhouse gas emissions. Install solar panels if you're able. And above all, vote with climate action in mind. Don't expect that your conversations about climate are going to result in immediate conversion. You are sowing the seeds that may flower at a later time. Well, I want to thank you for your attention and your time. Again, I've provided a list of reading materials with references that I've used to prepare this talk, so it should be in your email after the talk. If you're interested in contacting me, use the email and please put the word Spirit Alive in the subject line. It will help me prioritize your message. Again, thank you for your time, and I think we have some time for questions.
We do. There's so much to think about. I don't see any questions in the boxes, but I asked Matthew if the participants could use the raise their hand button so that he can allow them to speak to you directly, because I think there are some people in this audience who would like to have the opportunity to speak to you, Anthony, without my mediating their questions. But as the person who invited you, I'd like to thank you for this incredible presentation tonight with all the information you gave us. I guess I just would have this question. You talked about, we get labeled socialist. I don't think that's such a bad label to take. I lived in Europe for 13 years, and they have a remarkably different approach to, I think, the natural environment. I mean, just think about what happened in recent years with the stopping of flights between cities that could be serviced by trains to stop use of fossil fuels. You look at the kind of farming that's done in a lot of these places, and I think it comes from a spirit of social democracy and a sense of the common good. And I just would like to get your take on this. I mean, do you think in the United States, apart from all the other reasons that you gave, sociologists, we've just lost the sense of the common good in this country, which might be more prevalent in countries, well, I can speak for Italy, where they don't have all the natural resources we have, and they have to learn to share in order to survive, and they have to put the common good above. Do you think we're going to get anywhere without a return to that common good?
No, I think you're absolutely right. We need to re-examine our relationship with the natural world. There's no question about it. Um, and so that's uh, uh, actually, you talked a little bit about socialism, and one of the studies I was reading said that the younger generation are kind of rejecting capitalism as it's practiced in the United States today.
Mhm.
And they are looking for a modified version of socialism. Not, typically socialism is mixed up with, people say socialism, they're really talking about communism and communist rules and stuff like that. When socialism itself, and the kind that the younger generations are more interested in, is socialism that is modified, where it is based on your individual performance, say, merit-based performances, and a little bit more not money and how much money you have is the most important thing. It's more important on how you interact with other people in nature.
Mhm. Yeah. Thank you. Colleen Graney raised her hand. Matthew, can you let Colleen speak?
Colleen, if you unmute, you'll be able to speak.
Presentation.
Yeah.
I've encountered some naysayers in my position, and certain colleagues claim that climate change has occurred in geological time, for example, the Ice Age, and they claim that the warming that we're seeing and the CO2 rise that we're seeing can be likened to climate impacts and climate change in geological time. How would you answer those naysayers?
Right. So I would start off by saying that, if you look at the climate record, millennia ago, there were some fairly large climate swings. They could be correlated to CO2. And so the more CO2 in the atmosphere, the more warmer things got. And so as we move to the period where our civilization, the last few 100,000 years, where our civilization really developed, the CO2 level, the temperature levels have been pretty darn constant. And that's what allowed our civilization to flourish. Now what we're seeing is that, within the last few hundred years, the increase in temperature, the increase in CO2 has risen dramatically. And if you look in the paleo climate, you'll see that those kinds of increases occurred over millennia, not over a few hundred years. And so that's making a really big difference for how we're adapting to the climate crisis. So, I mean, the other thing is to look at the correlation between CO2 and heat and temperature. And there's no question where the CO2 is coming from. I mean, that's not a natural phenomenon. That's a human-based phenomenon.
Mhm. Thanks, Anthony. We have a
So-
question. Go ahead.
So like I also mentioned that Skeptical Scientists website, that's a good place to look for even better answers than I gave.
That's great. Someone asked, as a scientist, how do you not despair at so many people rejecting good science?
Yeah, well, it's something I've had to come to terms with over the last 20 years or so. And it is it is a little bit despairing, but you just have to keep plugging away at it and try and make progress where you can and have faith in humanity.
Mhm. And Anthony, you've done some work for the Diocese of San Jose. I mean, across the U.S., um, how do you find the response of, you know, the Catholic hierarchy? I mean, are they doing enough? Um, you know, I mean, a lot of people feel, and we've had this discussion uh, in other programs on Spirit Alive, that the hierarchy is kind of in bed with the Republican Party, and um, but I mean, can we look really to the church in America, Catholic Church, to lead the way on this, or are we just going to be the prophetic fringe, moving the grassroots forward without the help of our shepherds, except for Francis?
Yeah, um, I certainly have noticed a shift around 2005 or so, uh, where it seemed that the leadership of the Catholic Church has gotten considerably more conservative, okay, and rejecting climate change and things like that. The U.S. Council of Catholic Bishops, on the other hand, have put out some really great um, letters and whatnot that talk about the theological reasons why we should have climate action and care of creation. So I think there is hope there. I think there is a split. Some religious denominations are very pro climate action, and some are not. So I don't know how we get around that. I think I mentioned to you that as a climate ambassador, I try to go around to various parishes in San Jose and say, hey, I'd like to talk to your congregation about climate change. And many of the pastors said, no, that's just too controversial an issue for us to talk about. At any rate, I would, I would say isn't that the purpose of religion? Isn't that what we should be talking about, the hard questions? But
That's what we're trying to do here on Spirit Alive. Well, anybody else like to have this opportunity, raise their hand, make a comment, ask a question? Um, we still have a few more minutes. I know it was a lot to take in. One of our sisters was on this, uh, was registered before and kept texting me and saying, this is excellent. She's really involved in our sustainability work in a very large way, driving it at our Mother House campus, which as I mentioned to you, you saw at the beginning of at this filming, 222 acres out there. But we sisters are trying to do our best. What do you say about, this is just one last thing I read pretty recently. It was a criticism of U.S. sisters getting on a kind of bandwagon, when it comes to new, jumping on this, not really being involved in religion, but being involved in sociology, environment, and social change, and are basically people who have given up religion and faith and things that none should do, in order to jump on this humanistic, environmentalistic bandwagon. Have you met people who have criticized Catholic sisters for our forthrightness when it comes to this?
yeah, boy, I don't see that a problem with remaining a Catholic, even a Catholic clergy, and adopting a more climate relevant approach. I mean, that's exactly what Pope Francis is talking about. It's our core values in the Catholic Church are care of creation. That's one of our core values. And so I don't see how there needs to be a division between those two things. I think they're integral.
Mhm.
So
So Anthony, then I hope you found religious women to be good partners with you in this struggle to deal with climate crisis.
oh yeah, there's a lot of, there is interest. I've talked to religious organizations, Catholic organizations over the years, and they seem to be very receptive to this. They seem to believe in climate action and things like that. The other thing I'll say is that, most of my time is spent in California, and most of the people I talk to are a little bit more receptive to that than in other parts of the country.
You wonder, you just have to wonder why. I mean, what are they thinking in Texas that they can't think? Uh, that's
And
dissimilar.
getting flooded out all the time in Houston there. I don't know.
And being without power all of that time. I mean, you just wonder. And I think you made it very clear tonight. The social forces are so strong, holding people back from even seeing what needs to be seen when it's right
Yeah.
in their own backyard.
Well,
So,
for trusting what your own eyes see and what your own body feels, and instead listening to some hype that's made up, and not trusting your own senses to tell you what's going on. That's kind of it's kind of amazing to me. I don't understand that.
mhm. Well, I think this has been a very profitable evening for all of us. I want to thank you on behalf of all the participants tonight and the people who are going to be listening to you from other places in the world and are looking forward to hearing what you had to say. Today is September 11th, and this is New York City, where
Yeah.
we saw all of that destruction. So maybe tonight, as we conclude, we can remember and take a moment of silence to think about all of the people who were lost in 9/11 and all of the hatred in the world that gives rise to acts of violence like this, and challenge ourselves to be peacemakers so that hatred begins to subside and that weapons are turned into plowshares and people who know no peace will come to have peace. And so we ask all of this in Christ's name. Amen. Thanks,
Yeah.
Anthony. I think you will be hearing from some people in your email, and
Well, great. I look forward to it.
having you back. Thanks a lot. Have a great
Okay.
evening, everybody. See you the next time when we do Spirit Alive on October. I think it's Wednesday, October 2nd, when we have Chelsea King from Sacred Heart University, who'll be talking to us about Laudato Si and the kind of conversion that we need to move to this understanding of the common good and what we have to do. Good night, everyone. Anthony, have a great and safe evening there in California. If I'm out your way, I'm going to look you up.
Okay,
Take
it
care.
sounds great. Take care.